Somebody loves me. I wonder who he can be.
Welcome. It's The Private Life of Peg Lynch, our final episode. Now, Astrid King usually plays Peg, but here she's going to speak for herself and tell the tale of something that happened after Peg's passing, something that Peg herself, no doubt, would have loved to have written, and maybe she did.
I shout, hey, maybe.
On the 31st of August, 2015, I discovered somebody named Donald's ashes where my mother's should have been. I believe this is what might be classed as an error on the part of Dumbo's Funeral Home. Not, of course, its real name, but should be. Let me tell you what happened and where my mother, also known as Peg Lynch, ended up and how. A few months earlier, while rushing to do hair and makeup, Mama fell, either breaking her hip or, more likely, her doctor said, fell because her hip broke. And so instead of getting an interview with her, lucky Jim Levulis from WAMC Northeast Public Radio got to lift my mother up off the floor and into an ambulance. The doctors rang me in England. They said they were worried she wouldn't survive an operation at her age. Oh, I said she would. They operated. My mother not only survived, she was up walking the next day and exchanging pot roast recipes with a male nurse from Montevideo. The doctor said they'd never seen anything like it. I said, that's Peg. I rang her every day, twice, eventually dispensing with FaceTime because Peg, hating how old I look, would never hold the iPad so that her face showed, meaning I'd be talking to her left shoulder or the window or the oxygen valve over her bed, on top of which I spend most of the call being told to wave or say hello to anyone popping in and out of her room, doctors, nurses, patients from down the hall, the florist, the guy emptying the wastebasket, and so on. Peg kept them all entertained, and I'm sure invited them all over for dinner. Well, after a week in rehab, Peg Lynch, the 98-year-old medical marvel, was sent home. Her loving staff welcomed her back, not quite like they do, bowing and curtsying in tails and mob caps, flanking the front steps on Downton Abbey, but almost. Her decline, sadly, was immediate. I could hear it in her voice. I changed my plane reservation from the following week and headed to Heathrow, and I made it to Massachusetts in time. Mom and I had 2 days together. I sat curled next to her on her bed, holding her. She kissed my arm. I kissed her head. She whispered she loved me and was proud of me. I whispered the same to her, I hope. And at one point, she let out a wail and sat up. We all jumped to attention. What is it? What's wrong? What do you want? Mama, with a laugh, said, life. Margaret Frances Peg Lynch Ronning died at 5 p.m. later that day, cradled in one of her devoted caregiver's arms, Terry, because I had had to race out over the mountain to the stupid pharmacy who'd refused to deliver her prescription. Terry had also held my dad when he'd passed away the year before. She said she sang Peg an Irish lullaby, and Mama just closed her eyes. Well, later that evening, Dumbo's Funeral Home came and took her away, after which I spent my first night alone, ever, in my parents' house, listening to coyotes howling and racing through the woods, a train in the distance, owls or something hooting, and above me in the attic, noises all night, sounding like furniture being rearranged. I told Peg to stop it, furniture rearranging having been one of her favorite pastimes. Someone once said, it's a good thing your dad's not blind. He'd get up for a drink, come back to find his favorite chairs on the other side of the room. It was very true. But an investigation the next morning revealed a family of raccoons living up there. How they got in, I don't know. Maybe Peg invited them. Anyhow, the raccoon removal men were duly summoned, the raccoons captured and deposited back in the woods with strict instructions to stay put, whereupon I took a breath, rolled up my sleeves, looked around, and said, right. Thus began the official clearing of my parents' house and the trying to make sense of my mother's unbelievably enormous archive, tasks which eventually would take 3 months to complete. Meanwhile, 10 days after they'd carted my mother out the door, Dumbo's Funeral Home returned her to me in a brown plastic box. It was about the size and shape of a package of gold medal flour. I set it on the sideboard, next to the similar box in which my father had arrived home the previous year, and blew kisses to both of them every time I flew past, which is approximately 9 million times an hour, as I began a new life of sorting, scanning, cataloging, organizing, photographing, making piles, making phone calls, making more piles, boxing stuff, unboxing stuff, and making more piles. When finally I got up the nerve, I opened my mother's box of ashes, and I scattered approximately a cupful of her down in the lower garden underneath the rhododendrons, where a cupful of my father lay already scattered, as well as those of half a dozen collies. I also distributed some of Peg up by the garage, where more collie dogs lay buried, shook some of her into a Ziploc bag to take back to England with me, spilling some ashes on the floor in the process, which I then carefully scooped up after having reached for the dustbuster and thought better of it. My final good daughter act, or so I thought, in the ashes department, was then to see that Tom and Donna in Seattle got their piece of Peg, too. I shall explain. Tom and Donna are great fans and friends of my mother's and her work, and somewhere along the line decided they'd like to be buried with her. Now, I had heard something about this over the years, but had paid no attention, because why would you? So it wasn't until Tom rang from Seattle that I realized they'd all been serious. He was sending me, he said, a small memorial urn that he and Peg herself had chosen. I was to scoop some of her into it and return it to them special delivery. He and Donna would then keep it on their mantelpiece until they went, at which point the urn would be buried with them. Well, I have to be honest here. I am not 100% sure I would have leapt to do this had I not shortly thereafter come across a request in my mother's own handwriting asking me to carry out this task. So I did. The urn arrived the next day. It was about the size of an egg cup and inscribed with the words, Peg Lynch, radio and TV star. Okay, Mama, I said, you're going to Seattle. Well, some of you is. I put paper towels down on the butcher block. I found a Norwegian enamel demitasse spoon and very carefully decanted 4 or 5 teaspoons of her into the miniature urn, after which I got in the car and drove to the post office and sent it off special delivery to Tom and Donna in Seattle. Aren't daughters wonderful human beings? Well, despite all this intense scattering and decanting and posting, I still had the big dilemma: what to do with the rest of the ashes. Both Peg and Odd's boxes were still over 3/4 full and heavy, but outside of the egg cup to Seattle business, I'd been left no instructions by either parent in regards to their final resting place, or even, for that matter, in what form they wanted to do their final resting. Cremation had been my choice, and even that had given me pause for thought, recalling a phone conversation I'd had with my mother when she was in her 80s. There'd been a power cut in the Berkshires because of a blizzard. It was 20 below, and she and my father were holed up in the den together with the dogs, having to fill bathtubs with water to flush the toilet and heating cans of baked beans in the fireplace and so on. And Peg had said to me, you know, I always told you I wanted to be cremated? Well, I've been sitting here staring into this goddamn fire for almost a week now. I think I've changed my mind. I'm also not sure I want to spend eternity cooped up with your father anymore. Which is why, if I may digress for 1 second, why I urge anyone with children to please go write down at least a few thoughts on this subject right now as to what we're supposed to do with you, we offspring who just want to get it right, even though that is, of course, a technical impossibility. Well, once I got over being annoyed with 2 dead people who loved me for dumping this problem on me, I suddenly thought Casson, Minnesota, where my mother had spent her childhood. Now, probably not a lot of you own 10 burial plots in Casson, Minnesota, but I happened to. Peg's mother, Frances, my grandmother, had bought the plots shortly before her husband, Peg's dad, had died in the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 when Peg was only 2. Frances probably expected they had more children, I don't know. But in any event, when she died in 1963, she left everything to me, and everything included these 10 burial plots, which I hadn't really needed until now. I remembered Peg being kind of upset at one point when she'd heard from relatives that the cemetery now overlooked a trailer park and had a big highway running next to it. She said she felt badly thinking of her poor mother there, underground, granted, but always up for a good view. But when I Googled the place, it looked fine. It looked like a cemetery with pretty trees and bushes, and the highway was more like just a road. No sign of the trailers. Maybe the trees had grown. Anyway, I got their number, and I rang Maple Grove Cemetery. The paperwork, to my surprise, was on file. All was in order. And when I learned that Peg and Odd's ashes could be buried together in one plot, and I'd only be charged one burial fee, well, Casson, Minnesota worked for me. And it did so for another reason. I'd been feeling guilty throughout the last year of my mother's life. She'd been on at me about wanting to go back to Minnesota one last time to see it, to see where she'd gone to school, see the house in which she'd grown up. She wanted me to come over from England and take her, just us, and she wanted to go by train, and I don't know. I think I was coping with suitcases and walkers and folding wheelchairs and losing her teeth and her glasses and in and out of taxis and stairs and elevators and finding ladies' rooms and changing trains in Chicago and catheter bags and talk about nightmare journeys. So I kept putting her off, hoping she'd forget about it. But of course she didn't, and I should have taken her. But I didn't. But now I would be, in a sense. And as for my dad, well, that worked too. I knew he'd be happy anywhere as long as wherever his marvelous Peggy was. Well, after checking cemetery opening times, gravedigger fees, locations of burial plots, and so on, I decided I hated the brown plastic boxes from Dumbo's funeral home. And, hoping to find something nicer in which to bury Peg and Odd, I headed off to TJ Maxx, and there I found a sparkly leopardy jewelry box I knew Peg would love, a wooden box that would suit my father once I painted it more Norwegian-y, and finally, over at Home Goods, a glossy white metal barrel-topped trunk for $24.99, no expense spared for one's parents' last suitcase, which was just the right size to hold the 2 boxes of ashes and still be able to have the lid shut. The girl at the till said she'd bought the exact same one to use as a planter. I said, well, that's what mine was for too, in a way. Whereupon, once back at the house, I went around collecting meaningful but not especially valuable parent items, keepsakes, photographs, drawings, an old 78 record of an Edvard Grieg song, a carving of a troll, Odd's favorite pipe, Peg's Gamma Phi sorority pin, a Norwegian flag, sheet music, now is the hour, plastic lilies of the valley, Peg was scared of spiders, so wouldn't have real flowers in her bedroom, and all this and more I packed into the small white metal trunk, which I then shipped off to Minneapolis to James Lilx, my colleague here, to await my arrival. The ashes themselves I would hand carry on the plane. I didn't want to chance those getting lost in the post. I ordered flowers for the grave from Renning's Flowers in Rochester, Minnesota, still owned by a cousin, if I can get a plug in here, choosing red roses for love and juniper for the Norwegian forest. I also ordered bouquets for the graves of my grandparents, my great-grandparents, and for my 2 great-aunts, Helen and Elise, all buried at Maple Grove. I felt good, relieved that it was all going to work out. The cemetery then happened to mention that all ashes had to be buried in an official cremation urn, meaning something which sealed better than a leopard jewelry box from TJ Maxx. So suddenly I'm up against the clock, madly scouring the net for a not-too-terrible-looking urn that I hoped would fit in the Home Goods metal trunk already winging its way to Minnesota. And what I found, and paid extra for next-day delivery for, was fun, as these things go. It was an urn that looked like 5 gilt-embossed leather-bound books standing upright the way they would on a bookshelf. Perfect for Peg, who I think was born wearing reading glasses. And as for my dad, who I said, would be fine in a box of Kleenex as long as his Peggy was in there with him. Except I didn't like the books. Shakespeare, Jane Eyre, David Copperfield. Well, it wasn't I didn't like them, they just weren't pertinent. So out came the gold pen and the colored paper and the glue and the scissors, and in no time at all, once a prop girl, always a prop girl, I had 5 books with new titles. Ethel and Albert, The Couple Next Door, Odd Knut Ronning, World's Handsomest Husband, Peg Lynch, My Life Story, volume 9321, and, of course, on the biggest, fattest book, smack in the middle, were now the words, Our Perfect Daughter, by Peg and Odd Ronning. My flight to Minneapolis was the following day. While I was busy cutting and gluing, I had asked Bonnie, my mother's secretary, who I was still employing, to please take the cremation certificates, which she would find taped to the 2 brown plastic boxes from Dumbo's, and make copies. I would need 2 of each, one for the airline and one for the cemetery, and I could hear the printer going as I worked. Suddenly I hear, "What the heck? Who's Donald Bittner?" Bonnie appeared in the kitchen doorway, proffering, for my scrutiny, the copies of the cremation certificates, one of which I saw read Odd Canute Ronning, but the other one said, "Donald Wendell Bittner, as I shall call him. Cause of death, multiple blunt force injuries." "It was taped to your mom's box," Bonnie said. You know in the movies where something happens no one understands and everyone freezes and just stands there looking stupid, mouths hanging open? Well, that was us. Bonnie, me, outside Bob, the handyman, who was inside that day stripping wallpaper, Laurie from Kentucky, a friend of Peg's, who'd driven up to help me dismantle the house, Ken, a cousin of Laurie's who I didn't know, but who'd been extremely useful redoing the paving stones on the terrace, and the Culligan water softener man was there as well. Bonnie and I reached for the phone at the same time. Henry Dumbo was apologetic, but I have to say not as apologetic as I might have been had I lost someone's mother and didn't know where she was. I believe it was at this point that I reminded Henry of his earlier promise to me to look after my mother as if she were his own. Warning to Mrs. Dumbo, wherever you are. We learned that Donald Bittner had been a 66-year-old mentally disturbed Vietnam veteran who jumped off a 10-story building. And I felt badly about this, make no mistake, and I was glad I'd even been blowing kisses to him over there on the sideboard for 3 weeks, but I wasn't quite ready to take him to Minnesota with me. Dumbo's rang me 3 hours later, about the time I'd started thinking about 10-story buildings myself, to say that they had located my mother on Donald Bittner's son's bookcase over in Great Barrington. More good news was that she was intact, meaning the box had not already been opened and the contents scattered in the Housatonic or over Hanoi or anything else Peg wouldn't have cared for. And at 6 p.m. that evening, an exchange of brown plastic boxes took place in the driveway. Henry Dumbo, after a slight hesitation, agreed with our suggestion that he render his $3,000 bill for services null and void. I have no idea what he said to Donald Bittner's son, but as I never received an irate phone call saying, "Hey, there's 6 inches of dad missing here," I never pursued it. What I did do was head straight down to the lower garden and scatter some of my recently returned mother underneath the rhododendrons with my father and the collies and Donald, who I'm sure Peg and Odd will be nice to. They like company. I then headed up to the garage to scatter more of Peg near more collies and Donald, went back to the house, cut through the 900 layers of tape I'd used to seal the Ziploc bag destined for England, shook Donald out, replaced him with Peg, and took Donald back down to the lower garden, whereupon I returned to the house and rang Tom and Donna in Seattle to say, "You know that little urn that'll be arriving any day now? Don't get too excited." I suggested they find a calm and soothing place in which to dispense their portion of Donald, perhaps a rose garden or gently flowing stream. Then, into a small egg cup-sized plastic bottle from Rite Aid Drugs that Peg's gout pills had come in, I scooped 5 demi-tasse spoonfuls of her, snapped the top on, bubble-wrapped it and stuck it in an envelope, addressed it, removed Donald from the Minnesota-bound stack of cute books urn, replaced him with Peg, made another trip down to the lower garden, hope Donald likes rhododendrons, after which I packed my suitcase and, the next morning, drove to the post office, which was closed for refurbishment, drove to another post office, mailed the gout pill container to Seattle, drove to Bradley Airport outside of Hartford, and flew to Minneapolis. Piece of cake. Let me just say here that the possibility that Dumbo's might have slapped a label on any old brown plastic box after having filled it with sand, say, from Pontusic Lake, doesn't really bear thinking about. So I don't. I am sorry to say I had an absolutely wonderful time in Minnesota burying my parents, primarily because I wasn't alone trying to be brave in some motel or getting lost in a rental car. And for this, I will be forever grateful to my wonderful colleague here, James Lilx, and his family for stepping in and looking after me. James, this is your cue to explain how we came to know one another.
Well, because I was bored with Dragnet, I think. I listen to a lot of old-time radio, sometimes because it's good, and sometimes because you want to study the era and learn something about it. I'm always casting around for a new show. One day I stumbled across this file on the internet called The Couple Next Door, and I opened up the folder, and there's 750 episodes of this stuff. I think, well, this will keep me occupied for a little while. I start to listen, and I realize right away this is different from all the other comedies I've heard. A lot of radio comedy doesn't age well. It sounds corny today. Jack Benny works. Some of the domestic comedies are okay, but this was really fresh and different. It wasn't all gags. Instead of a joke every 2 or 3 seconds, it let the story grow and develop and burn, and then after 7 minutes, you find yourself snorting coffee through your nostrils because she's just given it a twist, and it's funny, and I'm thinking, who is this? I'm intrigued by the way the show is opened. The Couple Next Door, starring Peg Lynch, written by Peg Lynch. I thought, well, that's novel. And so after I've listened to about 5 or 6 of these, and I'm really getting hooked, I think, well, time for trusty Wikipedia, and I find out all the things that she's done, and I find out she's still alive. Now, she's old, but she's still alive, and I wonder, could I find her? So as a journalist, I put on my special journalist cap and did my, journalist kung fu and found her phone number. And my hand is actually shaking a little bit because I'm going to call a legend, and I did. And she... Well, I expected to get a nurse saying, "Hello, are you looking for Helen? Yes, is Miss Lynch there? Oh, this isn't a good day. I'll let her know you called." This is what I expect. But the phone rings, picks it up, and I say, "I'm looking for Peg Lynch." "Well, you found her."
Shortly thereafter, my phone rings in England. "Hi," says Peg. "You in the middle of dinner?" "It's 2 a.m, Mother." Not once in 35 years did she ever get the time difference right between Massachusetts and the UK. "I've just been talking to a darling man," she says. "He called me up. And he's from Minnesota. Isn't that fun? He wants to come interview me. I've told him to come stay at the house." I asked what the guy's name was. "Oh, hang on," she says. "I wrote it down." Minutes went by. Possibly hours. Days. "Well, no, I can't find it," Peg says. But it's a flower." "What's a flower?" "His name, it's a flower." "Like what?" I said, "What, Mr. Rose?" "No, it's not Rose." "Tulip?" No. Nor was it Mr. Astor, Mr. Peony, Chrysanthemum, by which time I'm crouched on the floor of the bathroom so as not to keep my husband awake. And 3,700 flowers later, we moved on to bushes, and we got to lilacs. "Lilacs! Yes!" she cried. "Yes, but it's spelled differently." Well, the next day I Googled and I found a Minnesota writer named James Lilx. Impressive CV. I thought, well, this guy could well be an axe murderer with a penchant for dismembering old lady comedy writers in their beds, but I'm going to take a chance here. I messaged James on Twitter, and he answered.
And then it began. I got permission to come, and let's just say it was wise, perhaps, for Astrid to vet me before the event of meeting her mother. So we met at this place and got on like a house on fire, and apparently I passed the test, whatever tests there would be. And the next day, I drive up to the house, wondering what I'm going to say, and there she is standing outside, and I greeted her with the words that I wanted to tell her since the moment I started listening to her show. "You are my favorite genius." And we became fast. Well, it's hard not to be fast friends with Peg. She invited everybody in. We sat down, and she started talking. I just had to get out my little recorder, hit record, and let the stories unspool, which we did. And then we'd sit around and watch some of the television shows that nobody else had seen in half a century. And I'm feeling like I'm being let into this very select group of people who are able to see what she did. And it was marvelous. And I'm laughing, and she's seen them a million times, but it was just absolutely delightful. I could have stayed forever, but I had to go home. And from time to time, we'd call. She would call me at work. I remember calling her when I think she fell ill, was in the hospital, and it was extraordinary to have that connection. And I mean, it's great to know somebody who's famous and talented, but it went beyond that. It was great to know Peg. And so we all became close friends.
Which is why James invited me to stay with him and his family in Minneapolis. And he kindly took me around the University of Minnesota, where my mother had been a student in 1936. I walked the streets Peg would have walked on her way to classes. I saw the library she would have used, her Gamma Phi sorority house. It was quite simply wonderful. And then on my last day, I opened the white metal trunk I had had shipped out from Massachusetts, and I repacked it to now include the cute book urn full of Peg and Odd's ashes, which fortunately fit. And James and I put it in the car, and we set off for the small town of Casson, about an hour and a half drive south of Minneapolis. We were early for our rendezvous at the cemetery, so we decided to track down the house in which my mother had grown up, where her mother Frances had grown up, where my great-aunts Helen, the bookkeeper, secretary, and Elise, the doctor, had grown up, the house that Peg had wanted to see one last time.
That would be the house that you were too lazy and selfish a daughter to escort.
Yes, James, thank you. That was the very one. Yes, thank you.
Well, the address appeared not to exist at all. We drove up and down every single street again and again and again, which does not take long because Casson is not exactly a bustling
And may I just say
metropolis.
here, town of Casson, you sure do number your streets weirdly. Around and around we drove, counting numbers, counting again, turning around, comparing chimneys and gables and sidewalks to the old photos I'd brought along. And
Finally, we go to the post office because if anybody knows if the address exists, it's got to be the post office, right? And they said, yeah, yep. So gave it one more shot, went down the same street, turned a corner we'd already turned about 60 times, and whoa, there it is. It's Casson's famous magic disappearing running Lynch house right there.
I had recognized the two big maples in the front yard suddenly, which turned out to be not maples, but black walnut trees. And the house is green now instead of white, and the porch is closed in. But it's the house. It's Mama's house. I rang the bell, but nobody was home. So James just took my picture standing in front of it, and then it was off to Maple Grove Cemetery.
Good news, no sign of the trailers that Peg had been worried about. Just blue sky and sun and trees. A beautiful Minnesota day. And there was a highway nearby, yes, but you would hear the high whine of the cars, a nice little song. So it was quite peaceable.
And Nancy was her name. She was the official from the town hall. She met us, and she led us to the right area of the cemetery, which was marked by an upright granite monument saying Lynch, erected, I imagine, by my grandmother at some point. James and I carried the white home goods trunk from the car. We set it on the piece of astroturf next to the grave. I placed the roses and the juniper I'd ordered on it, and I stepped back, looked at it some more, took a photo of it, and James asked if I'd prepared any words to say. Words? No. Hell no, I hadn't. I hadn't even thought about it. I had so much other stuff to think about. Immediately I felt terrible. I guess I just figured I'd be alone there, you know.
Well, I asked Astrid if she thought that playing one of Peg and Odd's favorite pieces of music would be appropriate in a cemetery, and she looked puzzled. What are you talking about? What do you want me to sing? And I explained, one of the keepsakes that had been packed into the white metal trunk had been her parents' old 78 RPM record of a Grieg song that I cannot hope to pronounce, but with your Scandinavian...
Jeg elsker deg.
Edvard Grieg's best-known song, I Love Thee, is a musical love letter set to the words of a poem by Hans Christian Andersen, the celebrated author of fairy tales. Mr. Björling sings this immortal love song in Norwegian, the language in which it was originally written.
Well, unbeknownst to Astrid, I had made a copy of that recording.
Peg used to play the song on the piano all the time, and Odd would sing it in the original Norwegian, of course, and it was a perfect ending, I thought. Plus, it's short.
So I set a little Bluetooth speaker on top of a granite stone that said Lynch and pressed play.
And a moment later, the voice of the great tenor Jussi Björling rang out across Maple Grove Cemetery, empty now except for us, and I said a silent goodbye to my parents. You have become the single thought of my thoughts. You are the first love of my heart. I love you as no one else here on earth. I love you for time and eternity. I love you for time and eternity. Well, I waited to make sure the gravedigger buried the white metal trunk. Well, you never know, do you? You don't want people pawing through your parents' stuff as soon as your back's turned, or adding things to book titles like Who Never Took Her Mother to Minnesota While She Was Alive. After which I blew a last kiss to Mama and to Daddy, and to my grandparents, Francis and Hugh, my great-grandparents, Lydia and Frank, to great-aunt Elise and to great-aunt Helen. And the next day I flew home to England. But a year later, I was back to see the headstones I had ordered in situ. I hope I got it right. See what you think.
Odd Knut Ronning, 1918 to 2014. Engineer, Norwegian war hero, the handsomest husband in New York. Jeg elsker deg.
Margaret Frances Lynch, 1916 to 2015. Writer, actress, trailblazer, the woman who invented sitcom. Finally, a plot.
Let's give the great lady herself the final words here, shall we? In the year 2000, Peg Lynch was interviewed by the BBC Radio for a program about her called The Woman Who Invented Sitcom.
And after 3 days of nonstop stories and anecdotes and laughing himself silly, the interviewer asked my mother if she had ever considered writing a memoir.
And how did she answer?
Oh, a memoir? What the hell's nothing's happened to me?
We can put all this tape.
Nothing's happened to her.
I know, Jane. It's a shame, isn't it, that I had such a boring, uninteresting mother.
I mean, she really never did that.
Well, I know. I can't believe really. I mean, it's the way she